Okay, in this series of video tutorials, what we're going to be focusing on is some of the primary retouching tools in Photoshop. But before I continue on that, just be aware that when we get into retouching, restoring, or repairing imagery in any way, there are a number, actually somewhat of a limitless number of creative applications you can use that would be relative to retouching that actually has nothing to do with the primary retouching tools. So there is a high level of technical skill that you need to know to do retouching, but also there's a lot of creative use of the tools in Photoshop to do retouching, restoring, and repairing. So just be aware that we're going to just kind of touch the surface with the basic tools that we're covering, and then as we develop our other skills in Photoshop, you can combine those with the retouching tools and make them even more powerful than they are at their defaults. So to begin, I usually start with the clone stamp tool. The reason why I start with the clone stamp tool is because that was one of the initial cloning and or retouching tools that was developed. So from the clone stamp tool, all of the other specific retouching tools, algorithms came from that. So if you get a strong understanding of all the options with the clone stamp tool, you then develop a strong understanding of how all the other retouching tools work. So let's begin with that. So the clone stamp tool is over here on the left. The S key gets you to the clone stamp tool, but notice for a lot of the retouching tools, they have the same key command for either the sub tool or the top tool or the list of tools in the tool panel. How to cycle through them is you hold down the shift key and then continue to hit the S, and then that will scroll through the list of tools or go back and forth if there's just two. So for the clone stamp tool, there's a number of things to consider, and this in general to retouching. Now, in earlier versions and earlier years of Photoshop, most retouching, a lot of the tool functions were destructive by nature. But now, with the new upgrades and new advancements in these tools, they've provided ways for us to make retouching and correction and restoration and repairing almost fully non-destructive. So the way you do that is most of the tools now have the ability to sample a layer source that is not connected to the layer that you're working on. So to start, you would keep your background layer locked if you're just doing regular image retouching, not compositing, and then you do Command-Shift-S or go to your layer panel menu and do New Layer. And this creates a new blank layer in the Layers panel. So just transparent pixels. So I'll do Command-Shift-N, that opens up the New Layer Options dialog box. Then you can label the layer. So since I'm working with the clone tool, I'm just going to write clone stamp so that I know anything that I clone stamp on this layer, I can then modify it and then make separate layers for the different retouching tools if I want to. But it's totally okay to do all your retouching on one layer depending on how much retouching, repairing, and restoring you need to do. Sometimes restoration and repair jobs require multiple layers, so you wouldn't want to do it all in one layer. So once you have your new layer set, this is like the first step you want to do for all the retouching tools, because they all now have that capability to retouch on a blank layer above the layer that you actually want to fix or repair. So got my new layer, I labeled it correctly so that I understand where that's at. So now the next step you want to do is move up to the control panel and kind of work your way across. So this first round, I'm going to describe all the parts. So the first thing you want to look at is many of the retouching tools are a brush-based tool, meaning that you have access to your brushes panel. So when you open up the preset menu for your brushes, you have the ability to change its diameter, you have the ability to change its size, and its hardness. Hardness is relative to the feather on the brush. So down here they give you a preview of what the brush stroke will look like. So hardness is relative to transparency. So the less hardness you have, the softer and more transparent the blend will be around the edge of your retouching brush. We're not talking about painting here. We're talking about using cloning as a retouching option. And then if you increase the hardness and you make a hard round brush, then you get a hard edge on the brush. So there is no feathering of transparency of the source material you're pulling when you're doing retouching work. So usually it's a good idea to start off with a very soft brush, or what we call a soft round, and then adjust the pixel size based on the pixel dimension of your image. So I think 90 works pretty well for the stuff that we're going to be retouching in this image. And then when you start with a soft round brush, if it's a little bit too much blending or too much feathering, you can always dial back on it and repair it because we're working non-destructively with our extra layer. So once we get our brush into queue, I just want to point out some areas. You have access to all your custom brush functions with this particular brush that we set. So this is a much more advanced level for customizing the brushes individually, using all of the incredible default brushes Photoshop has, and then creating your own custom brushes that you can create using the customize functions in Photoshop. And then of course for each of the brushes, they have all of these parameters that you can change, and each of these parameters have multiple parameters within them that you can adjust. So that is quite a bit of information, but it also provides knowledge for you that there is so much customization you can do to get a retouching or cloning piece to match the pixels that you're working on top of. Then next, another advanced feature that I'm just going to describe but not go too far into, you can manipulate and customize your clone source. So when you click on this button, there's all ways to customize the source and how the source is coming in. Very advanced, awesome tool, totally makes retouching incredibly customizable, but not going to cover that too far today. So next is blending modes. We're going to have a separate tutorial on blending modes, but again, a way to blend pixels together in all different ways based on base layer and top layer and things like that. Very, very powerful functions, but once we do blending modes, you can review that tutorial, then come back here and utilize that function. Now, transparency. Transparency is one of those options that you will certainly use when you're using the clone stamp tool. It is very helpful for stacking semi-transparent layers on top of each other to slowly build the retouching or repairing that you're doing, because not everything needs a completely opaque layer of retouching to make it look good. What you could do is simply bring this down 50%, and by painting 50% of a source over a blemish on skin, it may actually work and make it look more realistic than going all the way 100% and having full skin cover it. So again, that's a creative application of using opacity, but that's where it comes in. Now, just to remind you of the relationship between opacity and flow, flow governs by percentage how much opacity is laid down. So for instance, if I had my opacity set at 100%, but my flow was set to 50, that means that I would get 50% of 100 laid down in my first stroke. Then when I did another stroke on top of that, I'd get another 50% of 100, which would then equate to 100%. So you can control flow to control the amount of opacity that's being laid down. That way you can control how much goes down per stroke. Now next, another option that you often want to check before you begin is your align feature. The clone stamp requires you to use a source to paint material on top of an area that you want to cover up. So you either have that source aligned to each stroke, or you can have it stay in one place so when you do new strokes, it doesn't move from that original location. So it will keep sampling from the same source based on the length of your stroke, not the distance you are from the object you're trying to cover. And then lastly, but most importantly, when you're doing non-destructive clone stamping, you have to check your sample box, because the sample box is directly related to what the clone stamp tool is going to pick up and where it's going to put down. So you have current and below, so it's going to pick up pixel data from the current layer it's on and the layer below, or you have all layers, so it's going to pick up, if you're doing composite work and you have like 16 pixel layers and then your clone stamp layers on top of all of them, it will pull from all the layers and put on the currently selected layer your clone stamp source material. And then you have current layer. Current layer is when you're using it destructively. If you want to work directly on a pixel layer, you choose current layer. It only pulls from that layer and will just clone stamp on top of it. So that's the non-destructive or the destructive method. And then this button we'll talk about in a later tutorial when we go over adjustment layers, but this is controlling whether the clone stamp tool recognizes your adjustment layers or not. And then the rest of the buttons are for tablet and tablet sensitivity. So that is a clone stamping control panel. So I will break up this tutorial to make it more manageable to watch later. So I'm going to stop this one now, and then in the next tutorial we're going to actually activate these functions and start clone stamping.